Hey, friend, and Happy New Year. Oh boy, what a year it's going to be. With U.S. presidential elections ahead, global wars raging, AI on the rise, public health, environmental, and economic concerns all heightened, the decisions we make this year will be consequential ones. Courageous and intentional leadership will matter. Authentic messages will matter, and equitable approaches will matter. You are going to need a trusted partner as you navigate through whatever challenges unfold for you in this year ahead. And I promise I will be there with you through it all. In just a few weeks, we will kick off season 9 of the Mission Forward podcast, and it is expected to be our most incredible yet. With global thought leaders who will provide their take on the issues and practical approaches to help you navigate those issues, I'm going to meet you where you are and help you guide your year ahead as a communicator for change. Now, we'll be back in just a few weeks with all new content. But until then, I hope you enjoy some of our most listened to shows from last season. And I hope you'll drop me a line if there's something you hope to hear on the show in the new year. You can get me over at Carrie at mission.partners. Until then, I hope you enjoy today's show, and I look forward to being back with you soon. Hi there, and welcome to the Mission Forward podcast, where each week we bring you a thought-provoking and perspective-shifting conversation on the power of communication. I'm Carrie Fox, your host and CEO of Mission Partners, a social impact communications firm and certified B Corporation. And today, we are inviting you to join us for a very special conversation with George Jones. George is the CEO of Washington, D.C.-based Bread for the City, which supports people living with low incomes to develop their power to determine the future of their own communities. They provide food, clothing, medical care, and legal and social services to reduce the burden of poverty. What I will tell you is that George is one of Washington, D.C.'s most effective leaders, working to solve some of the city's most pressing challenges. So effective, in fact, that Georgetown University honored him a few years back with the John Thompson Jr. Legacy of a Dream Award. What I love about George, though, is not the awards he's won, but that he doesn't exist to advance just the mission of Bread for the City. He exists to address solutions to the root causes that exist around poverty, homelessness, and food insecurity in DC. And I think that's what you will take away from learning from him today. George, as we get into the conversation, as you know, on this show, we talk about the role that communications plays in social change. And clearly you have seen the effect of that up close. We'll get into that in a little bit, but first, welcome. And I'd love if you help ground us today by telling us a little bit about your own journey as a communicator for change.
Thanks, Carrie, for having me on. As you said, I'm George Jones. I'm the CEO of Bread for the City, and I've been at Bread for the City for over 27 years now. And it really has been a journey. Actually, my entire professional career has been centered around social justice, centered around providing services and supporting communities with folks who are living on low incomes. And so I've had, and in some ways, it feels like I've had two sort of phases of my career. Early on, a lot of the work was really focused on the direct services piece, sort of making sure that at every sort of stop, I was trying to address, in some instances, employment, access to employment, access to training opportunities, and more access to housing. But more recently, when I actually came to Bread for the City from Los Angeles in 1996, what I found at Bread and what I was asked to help lead at Bread was this effort to provide this holistic array of services to community members living in DC who were living on low incomes. So at Bread, as you said earlier, we provide food and clothing and medical and legal and social services. And that was really sort of what we were grounded in the mid to late 1990s. And that was important work. It still remains important work. It remains a real central part of how Bread for the City tries to address poverty. But, you know, in the 2000s, particularly sort of late 2009, 10, and really right at 2011, I would say, was when, in a lot of ways, there was a sort of a game-changing moment for Bread and for me. You know, by that time, I'd been at Bread for, gosh, almost 15 years. And one day I got cornered by some staff who said to me, George, it was right after Trayvon Martin was killed. And they said to me, hey, have you ever wondered why the only people who seem to come into Bread City, and we were seeing literally thousands of people every month seeking out services. And they said the only people who come to here are Black people or brown people, or people of color. You've ever asked yourself that question? And I hadn't really sort of analyzed what that was all about, the intersection between race and poverty. But the challenge they threw out to me is to go through, take racial equity training. And I went through a training back in 2011, 2012, that really sort of helped me gain an analysis of the intersection between race, racism, and poverty. And that was really important because, one of the things you learn in that space is the sort of role of power. And I happened to be blessed with a certain amount of power at Breakfast City. And so I was able to really quickly sort of make the decision that all of our staff would go through the training. And ultimately, we got the board to commit to going through this training. And that was really important because when we made that decision, we decided to go from just thinking about the direct services, what we now call sort of downstream work, providing services to people where they are, people who are already living in poverty, to try to go upstream and really think about how do you interrupt the systems that we really believe perpetuate the situation and the sort of existence of poverty in DC and probably throughout the country. So that's been a really big part of the story. And I look forward to talking a little bit about what that means. I also look forward to talking about, how we've been telling that story on our blog posts, on our website. And I've probably done a number of interviews telling the story about Bread's journey, my own personal journey, and what that's meant in terms of changing how we fight poverty in DC.
I so appreciate where you started, George, because I remember those years, 2008, 2009, 2010. There were these aha moments happening in social services that I think continue to happen, right? Sometimes those aha moments happen earlier, sometimes they happen later in an organization's life cycle. But that opportunity to think bigger and more holistically about the way that your organization was showing up in service of a larger, greater good beyond the sometimes what I think about as the production value of a nonprofit, right? It's not just about delivering services. It's about something much deeper than that.
Yeah, this idea of how do you really make an impact that transcends the direct services we deliver and really sort of, as I said, goes upstream and really sort of work with policymakers and work with the other civic leaders to really understand how do we sort of collectively change what's happening in our communities in a way that that hopefully one day really reduces the amount of folks who come in need of these direct services because we have systems that work much better, and we have we have a city, if you will, that provides opportunity in a more equitable and just way.
Right. Right. I mean, what an incredible goal that is, to really be focused on that idea of not just breaking the cycle of poverty, which we know is a very complicated goal to break, but to think about the role that every individual and every organization can play to advancing a more just and equitable society and world.
That's right. Yeah. This question about, I think when Brett started to talk about this and my staff started to push me, to their credit, to sort of be more progressive, to be, more outspoken about what can be done. I had some skepticism myself about what can an organization do to sort of about these sort of major challenges, these things that have existed for, decades, scores of years, if not hundreds of years. What could a Bread for the City do to sort of change the sort of what was happening, the trajectory of poverty and the outcomes for people living in DC? And what I discovered is that everybody can do something. Like individuals can certainly, minimally, individuals who care about justice and want to help their fellow community members do better can understand. There's a way to learn what we can do as individuals, how we can sort of undo some of the thinking that we have about why people are poor, the thinking we have about government and its role in helping fight poverty. And then we can think, in particular, those who are leading organizations like Bread for the City. And Brett, sort of probably is would be considered a large nonprofit. We're now a $22 million organization. But when I got here some 30 years ago, nearly 30 years ago, we were just under $2 million in an organization. So we were relatively small. And we have really sort of seen a little bit like Margaret Mead said, that don't doubt that a handful of people can change the world. In some ways, it's the only thing that has. And so I think we've adopted that belief that, the 140 employees who work here at Bradford City, the board members, we all believe that we can not only help change what's happening at Bradford City, but using our voices, communicating our story, can really help inform what the city does to try to fight poverty in a more comprehensive way.
George, I suspect there are probably days that this work feels like a job for you, and probably a very heavy job. But I suspect there's probably more days than not that it feels deeper than a job. And I'm curious if you're willing to take us way back, right? We know you've been with Bread for the City since 1996. What was your journey to Bread for the City? What kind of influences did you have along the way that brought you here?
I love answering that question because it really is a story. I believe I was about 12 years old when I decided I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to help people. And of course, as a 12-year-old, I didn't know what that really meant, what that was called. But there was something very much intrinsic in who I was that sort of said that I wanted to do something to help people. And my inspiration was, not surprisingly, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., like he was for so many people. I was born in 1960, so I was a young child of the civil rights movement, and so knew his story as a child knows it. But I was inspired so much by his challenge to serve people, which was part of his message, is that service was so important, and that was the legacy we should all try to leave in our lifetime. And so that early on, I knew I wanted to do something. By the time I got to college, I majored in psychology. I started to get a handle on what that would be, how I could sort of live out that sort of calling, if you will, to service. And my first job, I had an internship at a nonprofit in Chesapeake, Virginia, which is near my hometown of Norfolk, Virginia. And that was when I really saw for firsthand what the work looked like. I worked at a nonprofit that worked with folks who were suffering from mental illness. And that was an eye-opening experience, and it was confirmation for me that this is what I wanted to do. I mean, I think some people get in those spaces and maybe get, sort of overwhelmed by it and really and make the decision that maybe it isn't for them. But it was confirmation. I enjoyed that job. I worked for 7 years in that space. I ultimately ended up moving out to California and worked for another nonprofit that, interesting enough, changed the kind of approach it had to poverty. And that's the other thing I think I learned in my journey, is that there's so many challenges for people who are living in disadvantaged situations. And in that space, Los Angeles had the largest I think they still do have the largest number of people experiencing homelessness. And I went and got a job in Skid Row in Los Angeles and worked there for 7 years. And our focus was to try to figure out how to help people get off the streets, to get clean and sober, to get back into work. And so my early training and my early sort of story is all about direct service. It's all about getting involved, really getting your hands dirty, trying to figure out how to help individuals who were struggling with any number of sort of issues that really had them living in poverty. I think there were 10,000 people at the time living in Los Angeles who were experiencing homelessness, just in that downtown area called Skid Row. But it was such a powerful thing. And again, the thing I can say so honestly today is it was so clear to me that was where I was supposed to be. That was what I was supposed to be. I just loved doing that work and loved its opportunity to try to make a difference, in the lives of others. It was important work. It was rewarding. I got to do some got to elevate it to some supervision roles there. Ultimately, I became effectively the deputy director of that organization. And that was where I really sort of got some management experience that would really be really important when I finally decided to move back east and apply for the job at Bread for the City. At the time, the title was executive director. Ultimately, it was changed to CEO. But I came in and talked about, when I interviewed for the job, I remember telling the folks that the board that I interviewed with, that I saw myself as a servant leader. That that's the style of leadership that really sort of defined how I would approach helping lead Bread for the City. And I hope that that's been true. That in a lot of ways, service to the people who work here at Bread, always trying to figure out a way to make Bread a more equitable, just place for the people who work for us, and certainly service to the community members, that the tens of thousands we serve, probably 30,000 unique individuals every year here at Bread for the City, and trying to figure out how to make sure that my contribution to the work of serving those community members is a servant leadership style. But again, it takes me back to this idea of finding a voice for the organization around racial justice, social justice. I think it's the thing that's been the hallmark of the last decade of my journey, and speaking out and speaking to people who want to understand, again, this intersection between racism and race and poverty, trying to help people understand that there is a sort of a historic link to those things, starting from slavery all the way to Jim Crow to the civil rights period, and separate but equal. I mean, this country's been on a journey really trying to undo and reverse sort of all the ill effects that all sort of are rooted in the original sins of slavery here. And so, helping people understand that story, but helping to understand in a real practical way, that there are practical things we can do to reverse the sort of impact of, and a lot of that centers around one of the things that's really important is to talk about the difference between equality and equity. I mean, that's been one of the real important lessons. I think it's been sort of in the American kind of ethos that equality was the thing to be lifted up. And we kind of get the spirit of that. But the truth of the matter is, again, I think Dr. King was one of the people who said, I don't think he originated, but a quote he has is, there's nothing so unequal as treating people who are in unequal situations equally. And so that's what we learn in this equity space, is that, when people have been, and a race of people have been denied opportunities, whether it's in housing or employment or education, or in terms of wealth building, like all of the things that when people turn to us, we find that folks have been denied opportunities in all those spaces. And you're talking about people who are now in unequal situations with the rest of us who live in privilege, and who've had opportunities to go to college and to build wealth and to find jobs that pay living wages. So those are the two that's the dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots, if you will. And it requires an equitable response, something that is going to be responsive to the disparity between the things that those of us who have got these privileges have, and the things that folks who come to Bread for the City lack every day. They lack access to affordable housing, to fresh and accessible food, and to jobs that pay, a living wage or more, and the ability to create wealth. And so that's a part of the story. It's the thing that people who really want to take on this work will learn, and learn how to sort of undo, because we think that there are ways to really reverse those trends and eliminate those disparities, but we have to be intentional about it. We have to be committed to it. And Bread for the City has said that in this new mission statement, that's what it's about. And we've been trying to spread that message throughout this community. We believe that DC as a whole can be what we call an anti-racist city. We believe that it can be a city that intentionally eliminates the socioeconomic disparities that so many of the people that Bread for the City serves experience.
So what's striking me as I'm listening to you, George, is I suspect there are a lot of people who think broadly or specifically about Washington, D.C. and can name things that are wrong with this city. But I suspect that the gift that you have and your colleagues have is that you can see the city and its people and its potential in a slightly different light, in a different frame of reference, right? So I'd love you to talk about how you see your city, and then let's talk about what an anti-racist city can look like too.
Absolutely. Well, I see a city that is, particularly the residents of this city, people who as you said, they really see the challenges and want to. You rarely talk to a person here who doesn't want to help eliminate, or at least doesn't envision a city where we don't have all of these socioeconomic disparities that play themselves out between people of color and people who identify as white, the housing and the income and the health outcomes. I mean, you look at a socioeconomic index in DC, and the disparities between black and white and brown and white are just glaring. I mean, they're just extreme. But if you talk to the residents in Washington D.C., no matter what ethnicity or race they identify with, they would all say that those disparities are horrific, and we need to figure out something to do to sort of eliminate them. I think what I'm excited about, and what I'm glad you really have given me a chance to share, is this anti-racist DC campaign that I and several other DC activists have been really sort of trying to advance for the last almost 2 years now, um, and trying to sort of create an audience of folks who will get behind this campaign, uh, is is the promise that you alluded to. Like, the promise is this: that in a city of 700,000 people, many of who are very much sort of among the privileged, very much well off, uh, that those folks have power. And one of our sort of theory is that there are at least 9 sectors in DC that would be important to come together collectively to utilize the power to both analyze the challenges that are driving these disparities, uh, and then utilize the power that these sectors have, particularly when they work collectively together. And the sectors include business and labor and academia and nonprofits and philanthropy, government, faith-based groups, community itself. In fact, I should start with community, centering community members in this work. If we can bring all those sectors together, I really, really believe, I think our organizing committee, as we call ourselves, the Anti-Racist DC Organizing Committee, really believes that we could collectively come together and think about how do we behave in anti-racist ways? How do we create anti-racist policies? How do we create anti-racist behaviors? How do we create anti-racist goals and objectives? And of course, the ultimate anti-racist goals and objectives is to eliminate those disparities. And if we do all of that, and we do it at scale, in other words, if enough of us come together, if we talk about thousands of people in this city all committing to those goals, those objectives, and those behaviors, and we do it over a long period of time, we've sort of marked a decade as the sort of time period that we could see a real change. I've talked about eliminating those disparities altogether, but let's face it, even if we reduce them by half in a decade, people would, one, the needle would be moved so dramatically. You'd see those changes in terms of the quality of life in DC for people who historically have lived in poverty, and I think we'd really create a sense, uh, moving forward, that we can do this, that we can make the changes. You said earlier, you mentioned the term uh, breaking the cycle of poverty. In a way, that's an old concept, but in a lot of ways, that's a simple way of talking about what we're here. The other thing that I think is at least my own personal uh, ambition or vision about this is there's another term that oftentimes associated with Dr. King, which is creating a beloved community. And so when you think about, yes, changing these outcomes and these indices and the life trajectory for people of color, in particular young people, kids, some who are unborn now, that's a powerful thing. It's a technical thing and a noble goal. But the beloved community would be about creating a group of people who were committed to doing that moving forward, who would see that as a way of life, of sort of becoming together, staying together as a community, so that so it wouldn't just be a moment of time when we would eliminate those disparities, but we'd keep them from ever showing up again in this city.
George, the balance between those two concepts, as you noted, in an old, outdated frame of reference, breaking the cycle of poverty, to a modern, optimistic, progressive view of creating a beloved community, and the difference between the two of one is focused on the broken, the other is a community collectively coming together to
Absolutely.
support its own success and future.
and creating relationships that
Right.
are just as vital, if not more vital, to eliminating the outcomes. I mean, we really think that it's the relationships that will hold us, that will bind us as we work together. Because the work is, you said this to me earlier, the work is difficult work. We talk about leaning into the difficulty of bringing about racial equity. There is that challenge of you have to lean into it because it is, it's you have to commit to things like non-closure. We like in our society to have sort of a very linear. You do one and two and three. One and two gets you three. That's not really how this work will go. There'll be two steps forward and one backwards. We know that it's going to be challenging, and we'll be asking people to exercise sort of civic and philosophical muscles that they haven't really exercised, maybe in their own lifetime, because to a large degree they may have been working individually towards their own personal goals.
And you know what? There's no roadmap for it because we are, as you said, we're built, right? We're a society, we're a nation that's built on some falsehoods. And so we almost need to create that roadmap in real time around how you get to the vision of a beloved community.
And in our movement, we're talking about co-creating. I'm glad you used the term creating, because we use the term co-creating the solutions. People oftentimes ask me, George, tell me what the goals are. I say, you don't want me to tell you what they are, but what I'm asking you, I'm inviting you to the table to help co-create how we get to this beloved community, how we get to this place where these disparities just don't disproportionately affect one group of people over another. And again, the beauty of DC is that it's rare that you'll find somebody who doesn't say that they can get behind that premise. Like whether they're black or white, they believe that these disparities shouldn't fall along racial lines.
There is something it's underpinning everything you have said so far. And I'll just reinforce it because I think it's so important, is relationships. And that we cannot ever get to a beloved community without relationships. We cannot ever see a different future than the one we are living without relationships. There was someone who came on the podcast a while back. Her name is Mia Birdsong, and she wrote a book called How We Show Up. And she talks quite a bit about the power of community and relationship and actually redefining what community is and how to be in it together. And that it's nothing about the work you are doing is a simple problem, and there is no simple solution. So this idea, as you noted, from A to B equals C, or 1, 2 equals 3, it's so much more complex than that. And the power of what you've started to frame out here, the roadmap for an anti-racist city, is grounded in relationships first. Am I hearing that right?
That's right. So that's the work that we've been about. A lot of people ask, when are we going to start dealing with the policies and doing? We're like, we have to come together around our relationships. We have to bring people from all these sectors to the table, particularly people who have lived experiences, the community members, and the leaders in these sectors, and we need to come together and build community at that level, relationships at that level, because hopefully that'll sort of be what really bolsters us, really keeps us committed during those tough times. There'll be tough times, whether we have a down spiral in the economy or some incident that breaks out in the city. I mean, we need the kind of relationships and unity of purpose that won't allow us to quit when the when the going gets tough.
So let me ask you a tough question, and maybe there's no answer to it, but I'm thinking about all of those in our city of Washington, D.C., who have been harmed by systems, who don't have trust in the systems that exist. And yet we know trust is needed for those strong relationships and for this work to advance. How do you see organizations, or maybe it's even elected officials in D.C., thinking about how do we build that trust? How do we foster the trust to be able to have the kind of deep conversations that I know that's what you're envisioning?
Well, again, I think we're going to lean on this idea of centering community members, their voices, their physical presence in this work, and that's challenging. It means you have to resource that. You have to make sure that community members who oftentimes don't have the kind of flexibility that a CEO of a nonprofit has, who controls his own schedule and has disposable income and can can rely on an assistant to do some of the work back at the office, or a team of people while he's out at a meeting. We've got to really accommodate for that. And a lot of that really means resourcing and supporting those community members who have the lived experiences, who who probably, like as you said, struggle with trust to some degree and know where they've been disappointed and how systems have failed them personally. They can talk firsthand about that. We need those voices in the room. So that's going to be a big part of our approach to this work. We need them to be in leadership to some degree, which again means supporting them. The other thing we need is to talk about relationship building. I think both the analysis about anti-racism, which is a real thing, people can go through and really get a sense of, really to answer what I find with that training is you answer some of the questions you have about how this all fits together. You really sort of understand how to connect the dots. And that really, I think, gives people confidence that, okay, there's a real explanation about how we got where we are, and a real sort of I can see the vision. I can begin to see the vision of how we can undo where we are. But I think the other thing is something that I'm just starting to explore myself is this idea of restorative, justice. The idea that because the beauty of restorative justice, and not only is it sort of speak to, how do you get justice for people who've been harmed, in whether it's an individual case or by the government or by a system that they've tried to trust. Like there's a way there's approach to, sort of a clinical almost approach to restorative justice. But the other thing about restorative justice, it also starts with developing relationships. And one of the things that the experts in restorative justice tell you is one of the best ways to build relationships is to allow people to tell their stories. I've been really sort of moved as I've read sort of some of the literature by this premise that, start with letting the person who's been harmed just tell their story. Like there's something powerful about the ability to talk about whether it's in a housing system that's harmed somebody, or an individual that's harmed somebody, or even a nonprofit that's harmed people. And one of the things I've really gotten into practice to is I will share my phone number with community members, my cell phone number. I will let them come in and meet me. I had somebody in here this morning, and she said, you didn't even ask me why you wanted to meet. You just said, yeah, come and talk to me. Because I know the power of people just being able to share their story. Like that is the beginning of developing relationships. And so that'll be a lot of what we try to lift up and foster and build space for and around as we try to get, we try to advance the work.
So as we come to the end of this conversation, how in the world did that happen already? George, I'm ready to stay on the phone with you for 2 more hours at least. But I want to carry forward one more thought I'm hearing from you, which is we can think about the issues we work on as intractable, as so big they will never be solved. We can also think about what can we do every day to get closer to the story and closer to the storyteller? Because I think that's when relationships start to form, trust starts to build, change starts to happen. And I think you and your team are a great example of that, of how you are setting up a new set of norms and standards for what the future of DC could look like.
Absolutely. I should mention to that point, our governance board actually has majority of the people on our governance board actually are patients. They're community members. And so we have a board meeting every month. Every month I get to hear them. And sometimes stories that aren't so easy to hear about the disappointments they might have had when they tried to get service from Bread for the City. But having those folks in the room, both listening to me and my staff report out about what's happening at Bread, and having them tell me about their experiences and what their hopes and dreams are for how Bread will continue to do a better job. It is that creating that space for folks to tell their story and to speak their truth to us. That's so yeah. So Bread's trying to live out that, and so it's why I believe so much in it being critical to us creating those relationships that will help us make the change.
So a parting thought: where can people go to learn more, or what do you want to reinforce as folks wrap up this awesome conversation today?
Well, of course, you can always go to Bread for the City's website. www.breadforthecity.org. That's the place where you can see Bread's work, and we have plenty of articles about the racial justice work we've done, the systems reform work, and the direct services work we do. So that's the place we're going. We're still in the process of creating sort of updating our Antiracist DC website, and so we're not quite ready for prime time yet with that. But that'll be another space where we're hoping to sort of really have folks to be able to turn to it. And what I'll promise people is that ultimately that link will end up on Bread for the City's website. And so they will get a chance to actually to follow the work of the Antiracist DC campaign. And if they're a DC resident, particularly in leadership, uh, I certainly hope that they'd even consider getting involved in the work.
Well, George, what an awesome honor to connect with you today and learn from you. Thank you for modeling inclusive leadership and brave leadership as you all are going on such a remarkable and important journey on your own. And thanks for sharing such incredible insights with our listeners today.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. And I hope I get a chance to come back and talk to you again about our work.
That sounds like a plan. Thanks,
All
George.
right.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of Mission Forward. Thanks for tuning in today. If you are stewing on what we discussed here today, or if you heard something that's going to stick with you, drop me a line at Carrie@mission.partners and let me know what's got you thinking. And if you have thoughts for where we should go in future shows, I would love to hear that too. Mission Forward is produced with the support of Sadie Lockhart in association with the True Story team. Engineering by Pete Wright. If your podcast app allows for ratings and reviews, I hope you will consider doing just that for this show. But the best thing you can do to support Mission Forward is simply to share the show with a friend or colleague. Thanks for your support, and we'll see you next time.